Montage commercials are tough to execute, especially ones that have to be done in such a tight timeline. There are so many things to consider in terms of timing, talent, gear, and locations. In this video, we're going to be diving into a montage commercial we shot, as well as go over how we planned and executed this project. In addition to that, we're also going to be going into a full cinematography breakdown on some of the scenes that we created. This commercial was for the Canadian release of a shoe brand called On Running with a partnership with Footlocker. The goal of this project was to highlight their new Cloud Nova line and how the product could be used in multiple scenarios such as casual wear, running, and training. In addition to those scenarios, the main tagline of the campaign was "Cross-training ignites energy." With all that information, we could start with a creative brief and dial in the commercial that we actually wanted to make. My role on this project was the DOP and editor. I worked with the two directors very closely to execute their vision. With multiple meetings and agreed upon references, we made this deck to highlight the scenes that we were going to be shooting. Now, the final delivery for this piece was a 30-second ad, and you're going to be looking at this deck on why did we create so many scenes for just 30 seconds. And that's the reality of montage commercials. For a good, fast-paced montage commercial, you will only see shots for maybe 1 to 2 seconds at a time, meaning that you will need a minimum of 15 to 30 good and usable shots to use in the final edit. This is just a method of coverage that we've developed into our system in terms of montage commercials, because we find a lot of the times when we go into the post-production process that we actually don't have enough footage to work with. For this commercial, the 7 scenes or 7 scenarios that we planned for this were early morning solo running, early morning running with a friend, boxing, gym training, cycling, dog walking, and just generally hanging out with friends. 7 scenes with 7 different locations. Ridiculous, but necessary. And you'll see when it comes to the final edit that we had to actually scrap some of these scenes just because they didn't work in terms of what we were trying to create with this narrative. With the creative locked, we had 1 week to shoot, edit, and color this project, which was a pretty tight deadline, but as a production company in this industry, we're pretty used to it. At this point, I fully stepped in terms of creating a shot list and properly planning out how we could execute this project on a tight timeline. I made the shot list based on the day and locations and planned out a shot list that we would be shooting in 5 exterior locations at the best time of day, so in this case sunrise and sunset, and the interior locations at night. The key thing for montage commercials specifically is having consistency across your scenes. In terms of all these exterior scenes, to keep it consistent is having the sun relatively in the same position relative to your talent. So this could be sunrise or sunset, or just after sunrise and sunset. We didn't want to shoot anything in the midday because that would be super harsh and not keep the consistency that we're going for. In addition to this also gives us a passage of time, which is amazing for these montage commercials, because we're going to see early morning sunrises, a bright morning, and an evening sunset. With all those topics discussed, the next thing that we're going to be looking at is the execution on some of these scenes. The first scene that we're going to be looking at is this boxing gym scene, and I'm going to be going in chronological order in terms of the scenes themselves and going into the sequence that we shot them. So the first thing in this scene we used was the match cut for the feet and to highlight the product as well. For this, we had 2 overhead tube, which you're going to be seeing in some of the next pictures later. And this is just bare tubes shining downwards. And then this is giving us the levels to the room as well as the levels to the wall that you can see here. So just general room tone. But we actually had to kick out the product and highlight this a little better. And the way that we did that to actually light these shoes is that we actually had another tube light right here, and then that was shining with no diffusion. It's pretty harsh, and then that's giving us those levels on the legs as well as wrapping around the backside of the shoes themselves. And then this is pretty harsh as we're pretty close to the talent, and then I literally just have somebody holding that tube. We had to move pretty quick between these scenes and how we had to shoot this, so we had only maybe an hour in this room specifically. And then that harsh light is giving us all the shadow here, and it's just giving this nice product highlight that we can see here. The next shot in the sequence is the main talent hitting the punching bag. And again, we have those 2 tube lights, no diffusion on them, just shooting down, and they're placed right above the bag, in between the bag and the talent as well. As you guys know, I'm a big fan of top lighting sources, so we can see that top lit source right on top of his head, as well as highlighting the top of his arms, the glove, and then it falls off as we get down lower here. Again, we didn't have any diffusion on this, so this is pretty harsh, which you can see with the kind of raccoon eyes as well as harsh shadows on our main talent here. And to add a little bit more interest into the frame with some color contrast, I always like to push different colors into my lights. The main lights that we're keying with here are 2700 Kelvin. And then 2700 Kelvin is pretty warm, and so I want to push some blue into the shadows, and that's exactly what I did with this window here. And I used daylight to do that specifically. We're shooting this at night, and then we just had a Forza 500 outside just blasting and skipping some light across there. And then that just gave us a blue wash to the shadows. And also the colorless picked that out and pushed it even further. But just because we have that separation between our main key light, which is 2700, and then our light exterior out here, which is 5600 Kelvin, this gave us that natural color contrast in terms of what the colors could push in post. And now the last shot in the sequence reveals where we actually have those lights. So again, we have the two Titan tubes, like I said, no diffusion. And it's pretty funny that usually we rig these things up in a neat fashion or have some sort of magnet system or using proper clamps, but we didn't. There was an I-beam sitting right here as well as a vent, and then we just placed them up there, and you could see how exactly they sit up there. Again, this is something that just happens in terms of filmmaking. They look good as practicals, and as soon as I shot up, the director was happy with that. So we ended up using this shot. So you can see it kind of flaring the lens a bit right here. And you can see the placement of lights that we actually had them a bit backwards, so they're shining onto the talent in a way that provides us a shadow side. So on the right side of his face, we can see all this shadow here. And then on the other side of his face, we have that light. It's always best to shoot on the shadow side of your subject, as this will give you the most interest in terms of how your image looks. And then we have his shoulders highlighted here, as well as his other shoulder. And then this just gives us that checkerboard, salt and pepper, whatever you like to call it, where you're looking at light, dark, and then another light part of your image, and this goes across the whole thing. The next portion that we're going to be looking at is this cross training section where he's training with a trainer, and this is another part of the same gym that we were shooting this boxing scene in. So we kind of knocked two birds out of one stone here, that he's solo training as well as training with somebody else. And then in this, we kind of didn't have a lot to work with because of location was so tight, as well as location was dealing with a massive window. So in the back here, you can see it. This is actually a mirror, which posed another challenge. There is this massive window. And then what we did is we actually blacked out this window with a big black cloth. And we're really fortunate because it was kind of frosted, so you didn't actually see the black sheet. You only saw that it was a dark color, and it was pretty consistent across the whole thing. Now, as the camera was on talent's right side, we were going to establish that that shadow side was going to be on that right side. So what we did is we rigged up. I'm just going to use the mirror here. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 tubes, and we just used magnets. We were lucky enough there was a metal strip up on the roof, and then these were acting as practicals, as we want to make this as natural as possible. So this is giving us those levels on his face right there, and we didn't diffuse this at all. We just used this built-in diffusion, and then this gives us a nice light side to our talent's face here, as well as highlight other features that are there as well. And then our supporting talent here, we actually get a nicer wrap here and actually some of that Rembrandt lighting that we're actually looking for. And then they're nicely stacked, which gives you, again, that salt and pepper that we're looking for. Again, it's just a term that we like to use. It's otherwise known as checkerboard. So we're dealing with multiple light and dark parts of our image. So when it comes to these small spaces specifically, I just recommend establishing like a light and shadow side, framing up your subject, and then adding those lights in as you need. If we had anything else, it would be probably too sourcey or too much bouncing across the room. We just had to establish what this light side was going to look like. We're going to look at our first outdoor scene here, and this was by the water, and this was early morning. There was a sequence of running things that we did here, which were even earlier morning, where we got that gradient sky that was those deep purples and those deep colors that we're looking for. But this was just as the sun came up, and we were getting a nice hard edge on our subject, as well as a beautiful sky in the background. So again, this is just proper planning and knowing your location, because we did multiple scouts beforehand just to know exactly where the sun was going to be. And a helpful app to do that with is called an app called Sunseeker, which tells you exactly where your sun is going to be. There's nothing really to talk about in terms of lighting here, it's just picking the right time of day. But the main thing that we're going to be looking at here is composition. We're dealing with a lot of leading lines that help draw our eyes towards the center of the subject. And this goes just to having a good location. And also a lot of things that we had nicely there, because again, this is near the water and the water does pool up here. So I knew that we would get a nice reflection, and then just another point that points to our middle of the frame, which is his reflection there. So again, just location scout, find proper locations, do your research. And this just makes your job easier when you get to the locations and you place your subject there and the lighting is perfect in terms of the time of day. And it'll just make your job a lot easier when you're shooting these subjects. For this exterior location, we're dealing in a park. The sun is setting at this point. So I believe it was actually right behind this cloud, and we lucked out with all these clouds to give us a nice background that we're looking for. This is the actual sky. This wasn't replaced. And in this scene specifically, I like to shoot these scenes as one continuous rolling shot. As there's not really an action that we're going for specifically, it's just to get coverage of the scene. So in this case, Jason was directing the talent to say, hey, have a conversation, look at the dog, have the dog chilling for a bit. And then I walk in and shoot this. So I start really wide. So this was the widest part of our scene. And then as we go through some of these images, you're going to see how I move in. But I just roll the camera, walk in, shoot them, one person talking, shoot another person talking, look at the dog, look at the shoe, and keep a continuously rolling shot. That a lot of the times I use random inserts of whipping or just switching between talents, and that really works out for us when we're going in the edit and post. So looking at this in terms of a breakdown specifically, again, I'm on the right side of the talent in terms of their shadow side. So we established that shadow side by using the sun as a backlight here. So it's hitting the back of him, as back of his shoes, back of his legs, back of everything. And then it's hitting the left side of this supporting talent here. So it's highlighting the front of her shirt, the front of her pants here as well. And then even on the dog, fur actually soaks up a lot of sun as well. So this is why it looks a lot softer on the dog specifically, rather than our main talents here. At this point, the question that you might have is, how do you go about creating a project like this yourself? Montage commercials with multiple scenes, actors, and locations can be tough. But we recently put out a series of videos that goes over the entire process from pre-production to project execution and everything in between right here. Thanks for watching, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next video.